The river took her, but she came back with their screams. Once upon a time, there was a young lady named Ugochi. She was an orphan. She did a lot of things to make ends meet. She worked on people's farms, washed their clothes, and fetched firewood for them. The little money she earned was barely enough to feed herself. Then one day, she walked into the river, ready to leave everything behind. The weight of the world was too heavy and her life felt broken. She had stepped into the water, hoping it would carry her away. The river was dark, deep and cold, a place where things disappeared and never came back. She wanted to vanish, to leave the weight of the world behind, but the river didn't let her go. It pulled her under. Her body thrashed as if it had its own will, but the current was too strong. Something clamped around her ankle, like a hand made of stone. She couldn't see it, but she felt its grip. The water filled her lungs. Her chest burned, and she thought this is the end. Then everything stopped. When she opened her eyes, she wasn't in the river anymore. She was standing on something hard and wet. She looked down. It was a bridge, long and old, stretching into the mist. She turned her head. On one side of the bridge was the river bank where she had been. The trees were there, the village in the distance. But on the other side, there was only grey mist, thick, heavy and endless. And then they came. At first, they were shadows, faint and blurry, moving slowly in the fog. But as they got closer, she saw their faces. Hollow eyes, grey skin stretched tight over bones. Some were people she knew. A boy who had gone missing years ago. An old woman who used to sell herbs at the market. Others were strangers, their faces lifeless and empty. She tried to back away, but her legs felt heavy. She couldn't move. It was as if the bridge was holding her there. "Help me!" she called, but her voice sounded strange, as if the mist swallowed it whole. "They cannot hear you." The voice came from the center of the bridge. She looked around and froze. A figure stood there, tall and still. His face was hidden by a hood, his body wrapped in something that looked like old clothes. He held a staff in his hand, long and sharp, like it was carved from bone. "You stepped into the river," he said, his voice low and cold. "But the river does not take what you can still use." The girl's hand shook. "I didn't ask to be used," she said. "I wanted to leave. I wanted it to end." The figure pointed his staff at her. "It does not matter what you wanted. The bridge has chosen you." She wanted to argue, to scream, but her throat was dry. Her words stuck. The figure raised his staff and pointed it toward the mist. "Look," he said. The shadows moved closer, their faces clear now. Their mouths opened and closed as if they were trying to speak, but no sound came out. "Do you see them?" the figure asked. She nodded, her knees weak. "They are the unremembered," he said. "The ones who were forgotten by the living. Their names are lost, their stories untold, their graves abandoned." I don't understand," Ugochi stammered. The figure stepped closer. The air around him was freezing. "You will carry their message," he said. "You will speak for them until the living remember the dead. The bridge will not release you." "No!" she shouted, shaking her head. "I can't. I don't want this. Let me go." The figure ignored her. He raised his staff again. The shadows stopped moving. Their hollow eyes turned toward her. She felt their cold gaze like eyes on her skin. "You will speak for them," the figure said again. His voice was final, like the closing of a door. "The living must hear, or the dead will never rest." Ugochi woke up at the river bank, coughing and gasping for air. The sun was low in the sky, the world quiet except for the sound of the water. She sat up, her head spinning. It felt like she had been gone for hours, maybe days. But when she looked down at her hand, her breath caught. A small black stone laid in her palm. It was smooth and cold, with strange marking carved into it. She didn't know what they meant, but she knew it wasn't a dream. She looked back at the river. The water was calm now, flowing as if nothing had happened. but she could feel it watching her waiting. The next day, something strange happened. She was walking past the old burial ground when a strange pull stopped her. It was like a hand on her shoulder, dragging her towards the overgrown graves. She didn't want to go, but her feet moved on their own. One grave caught her eye. It was hidden under weeds and dirt, forgotten. She knelt down, her hands shaking, and cleared the bush away. There was no marker, no name, just a broken piece of pottery buried in the soil. She picked it up. A name was scratched into the surface. Ebuka. The moment she touched it, a voice filled her head. It was sharp and cold, like nails scraping on grass. I was wronged. She dropped the pottery, her heart racing. The voice didn't stop. Tell them, it said. Tell them I was wronged. She ran to the village and found the elders. They were sitting under the big tree, talking and drinking palm wine. She told them about the grave, about the name, about the voice. The elders frowned. One of them, a man with a long grey beard, shook his head. You shouldn't go near the graves, he said. The dead are best left alone. But another elder, a woman with sharp eyes, leaned forward. You said the name was Ebuka. Ugochi nodded. The woman's face darkened. Ebuka was accused of stealing many years ago. He died in shame, but there were rumors. People said he was innocent. The elders exchanged uneasy glances. Finally, they agreed to hold a ceremony. They poured water and ashes on the ground, spoke Ebuka's name, and called his spirit to rest. When the ceremony was over, Ugochi felt something lift, like a weight had been taken off her shoulders. For the first time since she stepped into the river, she felt quiet. But it didn't last. The voices didn't stop. Every day, they dragged her back to the burial ground, back to the forgotten graves. Each time there was a new name, a new story. A woman who had been poisoned by her sister. A child buried alive for being born at the wrong time. A hunter left to rot in the forest, his bones shattered and forgotten. Ugochi became their messenger, their voice. She told the village about the sins they tried to hide, the secrets they wanted to bury. It tore families apart. Neighbors turned on each other. Fights broke out. Old wounds reopened. At first, the villagers hated her. They called her cursed. They said she should leave, that the dead were better off silent. But then the crops began to fail. The rivers dried up. People fell sick with strange fevers. The village grew desperate. They came to her, begging to listen to the dead. The dead weren't just sad, they were angry. They wanted justice, revenge and peace. And they wouldn't rest until they got it. Ugochi did what she could, but the stories were heavy. Some nights she would dream of the bridge, of the figures waiting in the mist. The hooded man stood there, watching her, his staff tapping the ground like a clock counting down. Until the living remember the dead, he said in her dreams, you will not be free. Now she's the keeper of the bridge. She didn't ask for this, but the dead chose her. Their voices followed her everywhere, their cold hands pulling her towards the graves. Sometimes she wonders if she will ever be free, if one day she will join the shadows in the mist, waiting for someone else to carry her story. But until that day, she walks the line between the living and the dead, reminding the world that the past is never truly forgotten. Like my story, subscribe for more. Thank you for watching.